All right, welcome back to part two of our food systems lecture. Uh, this is Food Systems Week. I hope you all have had a chance to read or think about what we left off on the last video, which was how do we, or what are some strategies to um, feeding a growing human population? And what we left off with was talking about this concept of edible insects as an alternative source of protein. So I put some material in the background section that goes into this a little more. Normally in class, we would have a discussion about this and um, may or may not have tried to feed you crickets. But we can at least think about it during this time of COVID 19 as a solution towards shifting away from beef based protein options. So, this is the situation we find ourselves in. And in environmental health, population growth is a significant factor, um, not only in the food system, but a lot of the lectures that we're going to be talking about. But population growth is occurring on average across the planet. But if you break it down by country, some areas are or country or region, some areas are experiencing population growth a lot faster than others. So the region that's experiencing the fastest population growth is in Africa. So the countries within the African continent are amongst the fastest growing populations on the planet. The U.S. population is kind of steadily growing, and then there's a few countries that are actually on the decline. Japan being one of them. So again, the issue that we're faced with is given that generally we are seeing population growth. How do we feed this growing human population, knowing that the food system puts such a strain on the environment and ecosystems, and is such a resource intensive process. We talked about last lecture the inputs and the outputs that come from um, the food system. One of the outputs was greenhouse gases from the process. So cows produce methane gas. That's a potent greenhouse gas. Transporting food, etc., releases greenhouse gases. And then this feeds back into this kind of vicious feedback loop where the more greenhouse gases like CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, the more food we end up needing to grow ultimately, because increased concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere have actually been shown to make the food that we are growing less nutritious. So that same like acre of crops is not producing the same amount of nutrition ultimately. So we would have to eat more food to get the same amount of nutritional benefit. And as we talked about last time, the space on the planet with which we have to grow food is limited, and we're already using a lot of the space that can be farmed. We are using to farm. Another important ecological indicator that we look at is this ecosystem service of biodiversity, specifically um, pollinators like bees, and even bats and other creatures that help us pollinate food. So our health and nutritional system is so closely linked to pollinator ecosystem services that we can actually quantify the health impacts of if we were to um, basically get rid of all the pollinators on the planet. So if like all the bees were to disappear, what would that look like for human health? And on the maps, the darker shades indicate um, more what are called DALYs, disability adjusted life years. So one lost year of healthy life is one DALY. Whether you die, you've lost a healthy year of life, or you are sick, you've lost a year of healthy life. So this shows you where on the planet um, people would be affected by a loss of pollinators. Um, and you can see, and it's a lot of places that are experiencing population growth. So a lot of the countries in Africa are really closely dependent on pollinator services. So again, our question of the week: how do we feed the world? Can we meet the predicted rise in global food demand? So we know that population is growing, and we know that we're going to need to double our food production to meet this demand. How do we do this in a sustainable way? And this is going to require um, multiple actions on our part. It's going to include dietary changes. We're going to need to improve the technologies and management of resources along the way at different points or inflection points in the food system chain. And it's going to require a reduction in food loss and waste. We talked last lecture about the amount of food that is ultimately not even consumed. So we grow a lot of food that just kind of goes nowhere, goes away. So these are three kind of obvious ways that we can meet this goal. And the keyword here is sustainably. How can we set up a system in which we are not like kind of buying time or kicking the can down the road? How do we set this up so we can actually feed people in a way that can continue and is not going to slowly degrade ecosystems or ecosystem services? So you guys have probably all heard of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And I want you to think for a second right now, maybe close your eyes and imagine what you know about GMOs, what you think a GMO is. And if I were to give you the option right now of saying, I'm going to ban all GMOs, do you agree or disagree? What would you say? Or if I were to give you like the option of two bowls of cereal, and I said this one has GMO GMOs in it, and this one doesn't, which one do you go for? And if you pick the non-GMO bowl of cereal, think to yourself, why? Why'd you go for it? Well, because GMOs are bad, right? I've seen a lot of labels that say, GMO free, we need to ban GMOs. Where I live in Fairfax, there's a big sign on the corner of one of the buildings that says, we need to live in a GMO free world. But why? What is the issue? These pictures look scary. I don't know if that pig or cow picture is true or correct or has been altered in any way, but the kangaroo photo is legit. That is, I've seen a little documentary. I forget the name of that guy, but super muscular kangaroo, and I don't recall what the backstory is there, why it's so muscular. But anyway, so GMOs conjure up, I think, to a lot of people images of like lab experiments gone wrong. This is an actual real life experiment in which um, dogs have been genetically modified to have a kind of luminescent genetic expression where they can, essentially glow in the dark. And there's a lot of examples of this kind of stuff where we kind of have manipulated the genetics of species and organisms. And, this, I think, puts a lot of people off. It looks like kind of mad science. And it's like, well, I don't want to like eat stuff that's like gone through that kind of mad science, right? But we've actually been living with, and we are used to, and depend upon genetically modified organisms, and we've been modifying organisms for as long as we've been settled and growing crops, basically. So, in the human history, we started off as kind of hunter gatherers roaming around, just kind of foraging. moving from spot to spot, eating and foraging whatever we could to survive. And then we started planting roots, kind of literally, and growing crops, and then forming communities and cities and towns. And during this time, we started experimenting with the genetics of the crops we were growing before, obviously, we even knew what kind of genetics were, through processes of selective breeding or artificial selection. So if there was some corn or crops that were producing like really good fruit or really good, vegetables or had really good products, we would choose them and choose those seeds over like um, crops that were not growing so well. So if there was a plant that had was producing better, we would get those seeds and plant those seeds and not plant the other ones that were not growing so well. And then over time, we slowly essentially engineer artificially these more desired traits in the crops. And these genetic traits would pass on. And after, numerous generations, we would have a different looking crop because of this selective breeding. And this is genetic modification. And this is a genetic modification that we have become accustomed to, but it is genetic modification nonetheless. And the perfect example of that is corn. So, way back in the day, when we first kind of began this process with corn, the image to the left, that's what corn used to look like. Corn kind of, it was like a grass seed. And then over long periods of time, we started selecting for corn that produced these slightly different, bigger kernels. And then, you continue this process long enough, and we really changed the face of what corn looks like. So if you've eaten corn or anything that has corn in it, you've eaten a genetically modified organism. And it was just through long selective breeding like this. So there's your Snapple fact of the day or night, depending on when you're watching this. It's up to you. This is your quarantine. Use it how you like. Dogs are another good example of this. So we have essentially domesticated or bred dogs from wild um, wolf species to acquire the traits that we prefer. So we have slowly engineered through selective breeding dogs that we now see today. Um, that's another example of genetic modification. So GMOs are genetically modified organisms. You can think of those weird examples of like glowing puppies in a lab, or you can think of just corn. It's all GMO, but essentially, what that means is, we genetically modified organisms when we have or demonstrate precise control over specific genetic changes that occur or can be introduced into organisms. It is the incorporation of new genes from one species into a completely unrelated species through genetic engineering. So you can take the genes that cause certain sea creatures to glow or bioluminesce, and you can put them into puppies, for example, and cause glowing puppies. And then you can GMO optimizing agricultural performance. So you can selectively breed or reproduce crops, certain farm animals, or even like soil bacteria that are better at nitrogen fixing and stuff like that. So the history of GMO, as kind of modern GMOs in the food system as we know it, has a few kind of key events and is not super old in the United States in terms of the modern food system. So in 1973, the first successfully genetically engineered organism was the transfer of gene that encodes antibiotic resistance from one type of bacteria to another. So this is really important kind of touch point because it shows us that we can take the genetic material from one type of organism and transplant it into a completely different type of organism. So we're basically taking the um, characteristics that we like about one organism and then transferring them into another organism. And this was in the 1970s. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court ruled that scientists could actually patent this bacteria. Um, and one example of this type of bacteria that had been genetically modified was this type of bacteria that could be engineered to basically break down like oil, crude oil that occurs when there are oil spills, like when an oil tanker spills oil into the ocean. There is this natural type of bacteria that can break the oil down over time, and uh, the Supreme Court ruled that scientists working to patent this kind of bacteria that had been modified to better break down oil could actually put a patent on it. And in 1987, the first food crops that were genetically modified to basically improve the food system occurred. So this was a protein in tomatoes that was modified to basically make the tomato last longer on the shelf. Um, so the tomatoes theoretically would not spoil as fast and theoretically lead to less food spoilage. So obviously we're doing this because GMOs have really tangible and really profound benefits. So we've talked so far about, one of the problems that we face is we don't have unlimited space to grow food. How do we take the space that we are using to grow food, how do we produce more food from that? And GMOs is one solution. We can increase crop yields through genetic modification. We can reduce the costs for food production or even drug production. We can modify organisms to be resistant to pests, so we can reduce the need for pesticides and other like harsh chemicals because we can make crops resistant to insect pests. If we know that CO2 concentrations are making food less nutritious, we can actually genetically engineer food to have higher nutrient composition and actually increase the quality of food and nutrients. Um, and ultimately, we can increase food security by, for example, making some crops more resistant to drought. And we know that with a changing climate, we're going to have more extreme periods of drought. Can we alter the genetics of certain crops to require less water, for example? And this would mean greater food security for a lot of people. So in the US, we have been consuming and growing and relying on genetically modified crops. And the most common three are cotton, soybeans, and corn. Since 1996, there has been a rapid increase in GMO crop production in the United States. So herbicide tolerant soybeans have expanded from 7% GMO to 94% GMO of soybeans in the United States. 2% to 91% of cotton crops, and then 3% to 89% of corn acreage are GMO. And that's in the United States. So we've seen this rapid and really wide ranging increase. And with this has come a lot of resistance and protest. And probably now this is what you're thinking. Well, if I'm offered the choice between GMO bowl of cereal and non-GMO bowl of cereal, I'm going to pick non-GMO even if I don't know why. I'm still going to do it because I've heard a lot of this kind of stuff, right? GMO is bad. Um, but maybe you're confused now. There seems to be a lot of solutions to the problems that we're facing with how to feed the world without destroying it. GMOs can provide those a fix for a lot of those. Why are so many people against this? So, one, there are safety concerns and unknown consequences when we alter the natural state of an organism. When we basically manipulate um, a natural genetic, the natural genetic material of an organism, um, to maybe be less dependent on water. What are the unintended consequences of that decision? And oftentimes, maybe there are, or I shouldn't say oftentimes, but there could be instances where we can't anticipate what else might happen. So, sure, we might have a crop that needs less water, but how else have we changed it that might ultimately be bad? Um, it's these unintended consequences and potential safety concerns that have a lot of people nervous and concerned about GMOs. And one of those could be just direct health risks to humans. We know that food allergies are a health concern. If by modifying the genetics of a certain type of crop, could we also somehow increase um, new food allergens? Could this create new food allergens in people? What are the other health risks that we don't even know about? So you see a lot of stuff like this now. This is pretty common. This kind of non-GMO um, labeling of food in the grocery store, and a lot of people will go for this bag because it says non-GMO. Because well, we're supposed to be afraid of GMOs, right? But there is no such thing as not as GMO free. That bag of chips or whatever this is that you're about to buy does contain a little bit of GMO. Um, when you see a label like this, it just means that it can't contain more than 0.9% GMO. So there's a little bit, but there is some. That's because there's no way to completely eliminate it from the food system at this point. So here's kind of the conundrum. This is sort of, I think, a lot of the confusion around GMOs right now. GMOs have been in our food system for decades. So remember, the food system is that chain from food production to food consumption, and GMO production is increasing. Yet, a lot of people, I think, maybe are afraid of GMOs or resistant to GMOs. But if you were to ask them why, I don't know that you'd be able to get a good answer. Um, and surveys and assessments in the US, Europe, by the United Nations have found at this point no significant evidence that GMO crops pose a risk to human health. So, GMO risk is increasing. There have been a lot of studies on GMOs and the impacts to human health, and we really haven't seen anything yet. Um, in any consistent way, and yet people are still quite skeptical and resistant to eating GMO food. So why is this? Well, I think I would argue one of the reasons why is because GMOs have been linked to controversies, and one of the biggest controversies is with Roundup weed killer, which is produced by a company called Monsanto. And this has really gotten a lot of people upset and angry. And the GMO label has been attached to this controversy, and I think the GMO name has kind of been drugged through this controversy. So here's just kind of a brief story of this controversy. Um, there have been genetically modified crops that have been produced that make them resistant to weed killers. So, herbicides. So you know that, if you're farming some crops, you don't want there to be a bunch of weeds in there because weeds compete for resources, and weeds, harm the growth of your food crops. So you want to get rid of the weeds either manually or spraying a bunch of chemicals to kill the weeds, but you don't want to kill your crops. So the solution is to genetically modify the crops to be resistant to this weed killer. So you can spray your farm, it kills all the weeds, but it keeps your GMO crops safe. So one of the problems here is some weeds now have become resistant to herbicide. Herbicide meaning like it kills plants. So broad spectrum herbicides that you buy at the store can kill weeds and plants. They don't really discriminate. This company called Monsanto, which is a huge agricultural company, developed a new way to make crops resistant to their most popular herbicide called Roundup. Um, this gave farmers in the United States and elsewhere a really convenient way to spray their fields and kill weeds without affecting crops. Um, these genetically modified organisms that could be resistant to Roundup weed killer, Monsanto ended up patenting. So they patented the technology and the genetic sequence actually of these crops that could withstand herbicide treatment, um, meaning that you would have to pay Monsanto if you wanted to grow crops with their seeds. So when you spray this herbicide Roundup on regular crops and weeds, the herbicide kills the plant. When you have this patented GMO altered crop that is resistant to Roundup, it survives. And you think, well, this sounds fine. This sounds good. Crops that are considered, quote, Roundup ready, there's actually a lower environmental impact because you have to use less of these other harmful pesticides. You no longer have to till crops to kind of control weeds, less heavy machinery. It's just overall has like kind of a lower impact when you use this GMO method. But the problem comes when these GMO crop seeds are patented by Monsanto, so that when farmers who buy these Roundup Ready seeds basically have to sign an agreement that um, after they grow crops, they're not allowed to save the seeds to then replant. They have to go and buy new seeds from Monsanto every year, and that's how Monsanto makes money. So this is a kind of growing concern in the food system because right now, commercial seeds, so the seeds that farmers like in the Central Valley, for example, buy in bulk to grow crops, 53% of these seeds are controlled and patented by three companies: Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta. And the social fallout of this has been what I would argue is fueling a lot of the concern over GMOs in general. So, if farmers don't adhere to this contract, if they don't buy new seeds from Monsanto every growing season, they can be sued. So, farmers can actually be sued by Monsanto if they try to regrow their crops using old seeds. But there have been these circumstances where, like, a farmer could have some land out, and the wind has blown seeds from other fields into their field, or maybe it's been these seeds have been dropped by birds, for example, and will just start growing. And if it's shown that these farmers didn't buy new seeds that year from Monsanto, technically they've violated the copyright and can be sued. The other big social consequence is that Roundup, the weed killer, has been found to increase cancer risk in humans by quite a bit. And this was a big story, or has been a big story in recent years, um, where farmers have been, working with Roundup for years and have been exposed to this carcinogen, and these farmers have been dying of cancer, and juries have been more and more awarding settlements to farmers because they think that Monsanto's weed killer was a substantial factor in increasing cancer risk. So I think this is some of the controversy. So, you hear stories about Monsanto suing farmers, you hear stories about Roundup causing cancer. And then because of this story revolves around genetically modified crops and organisms, the name kind of gets sullied. So you associate all this negative stuff with GMOs. But going back to the big issue, which is food security, again, how do we feed a growing world? Um, GMOs might end up playing an important role. I think we just have to be careful with understanding the science and understanding the consequences behind them, but not just dismissing GMOs outright because of consequences like those produced by Monsanto. So this is a cool kind of side story that I thought you guys might be interested in, and I posted some stuff about this in the background material section. But genetically modified seeds are an important aspect of food systems and food security, and seeds in general, obviously. And this is an interesting project to protect food security, basically for the world, which is, well, if we're so dependent on seeds and crops, what happens if, like, all our seeds or all our crops go away, or something really bad happens, like a pest or something comes and wipes it all out? This is basically like our backup system. So this is called the Global Seed Vault, and it's up near the Arctic Circle, and it's basically this huge vault built into the side of this permafrost mountain that stays, frozen year round. So it's a natural refrigerator, and it basically holds the world's supply of backup seeds. And then, so because of this, some people call it the Doomsday Seed Vault. So here's an illustration of what it looks like. So we just saw the entrance just here, but it actually goes deep into the mountain, and it's this vault that is, naturally protected because it's in a mountain, and it's because it's in a frozen mountain. All the seeds stay naturally preserved, and it's basically like just there, just in case. And so I'll let you guys watch this at your leisure, but it's a really interesting look at what this seed vault is all about, and how it's kind of an interesting approach at increasing food security across the planet. So the United Nations issued this statement. They said, "We need a rapid and significant shift from conventional, monoculture-based, and high external input dependent industrial production towards mosaics of sustainable regenerative production systems." So that's a mouthful, but let's unpack that for a second, based on what we've just been talking about over the last week. Um, when you have a monoculture, like you have an entire farm that, like, just grows corn, that is a monoculture. Mono meaning one, right? Um, and that's how you are basically trying to guarantee food security and your financial well-being is you're basically placing all your hopes and dreams on the fact that that corn is going to do well. If you were to get a pest or a plant pathogen that comes along and only targets corn crops, there's nothing to stop it essentially from wiping out your entire crop. If you have nothing else, there's nothing to prevent you from going from a corn crop to nothing. Um, if you're trying to grow corn in region of the country where maybe it's dry or too hot and you need to add extra water to compensate for that, that requires high external input. And because it's a monoculture, you really want to protect against pests and plant pathogens. You're going to spray more chemicals and stuff on your monoculture to protect it. So the United Nations is arguing here that we need to grow more mosaic and sustainable food production systems, meaning instead of that huge plot of land to just grow corn, let's take away 20% of the corn and grow something else. Maybe some plants that flower and maybe attract birds. And because there are more birds around, maybe the birds are eating plant pests. Um, Maybe we take another 20% of the corn away and we plant some crops that attract bees or pollinators. And those pollinators can then go and pollinate the other flowering plants that we're growing. So the idea is that we're actually safer and have better food security if we have more um, like mosaic agriculture systems. So sustainable, healthy, and resilient food systems depend upon sustainable agriculture solutions. And sustainable food systems, what that means is that they have a capacity to continue producing food into the future. It's basically a system that we set up that can year after year provide food and enough nutrition for people, and doing so in a way that can be replicated. So we're not just depleting; it actually will sustain itself. Resilient food systems being um, if there is a drought or there is a plant pest that damages the food system, it can bounce back quicker. And the health of the sustainable agriculture system means that it can support health and well-being and the nutritional needs of a growing human population. So, I talked just now a little bit about what's otherwise known as an integrated pest management system. So instead of using a bunch of chemicals and stuff, we can grow, um, maybe some plants that attract birds, for example, that eat the pests. This is called an integrated pest management system. And you can read a little bit more about it in some of the background materials. But it's one of the solutions for creating sustainable agricultural systems. And it's basically like instead of using a bunch of chemicals, we use natural systems like, birds wanting to eat bugs um, as a replacement for the chemicals. So a good example of this is in rice production systems in Japan, where farmers mimic natural systems by putting ducks into the rice paddies. The ducks eat weeds and insects that could potentially damage the rice crop, and the ducks also produce fertilizer just by doing their duck thing. Um, and this ultimately reduces the cost of pesticides and fertilizers, and you get a little extra as a farmer because now you have like duck eggs and maybe duck meat to supplement your revenue. So these are solutions that we in the United States need to be thinking about and need to be working with now. And as an environmental health scientist or potentially a future environmental health scientist, this is something that you guys should be thinking about. Um, And one of the solutions is going to be a shifting from the dietary behaviors that we see, at least in the United States right now. So, overall, there has been a rapid increase in the demand for beef production. But we know, and we've talked about, that beef production has a lot of negative outputs, specifically greenhouse gas emissions, and is really not a big part of a sustainable food system. So, again, the goal here is to create a food system that is sustainable. And having more and more beef in the system is not sustainable because beef is resource intense. For one hamburger patty, one In-N-Out burger requires 6.7 pounds of grain. So think about a 6.7 pound bag of grain that needs to go into that. 52 gallons of water for growing the grain and for the cow. 74.5 square feet of land. And then a lot of energy from fossil fuel to keep this whole system running. So a lot of inputs for relatively small output, right? And you may be saying, well, Dr. Bales, an In-N-Out burger is not a small output. It's delicious. It's magical. It makes me happy. Well, I would argue that as part of a sustainable food system, it's maybe not that we get rid of that In-N-Out burger, but we adjust our behavior and adjust maybe how much we eat of it, for example. So I posted this to the background material section. Give it a quick look. It's an interesting, I think, a little bit of background information about cow farts, climate change, and what role that plays in the sustainable food system. So I ended the last lecture, and I'll end this one too, by talking about the role of alternative protein sources in fostering a sustainable food system. So there's a big taboo in the United States around eating bugs. We eat beef, pork, and chicken, and that's normal. That's protein, and that's just what you do. That's food, right? But bugs are not what you do. Bugs are for the garden, or bugs are for the bottom of your shoe, right? But it turns out bug consumption in the United States is really, really low. But a lot of people are arguing that it's missed opportunity to foster a sustainable food system because insects are actually a really, really good and nutritious source of protein and nutrients. So I posted this to the background section page too, and I think it makes a good argument for, edible insects and their potential role in the food system. So go ahead and watch that as well. I think it's worth having the discussion of what edible insects play in this food system, but it's not the silver bullet. It's not the magical cure-all. But I think it's one of many solutions that we're going to need to come up with to produce a food system that is good for human health and the health of ecosystems as well. And that's the only way we can have sustainability is if we come up with win-win solutions. So that has been our little mini exploration into food and environmental health. I have been Dr. Bales, sheltering in place, keeping my physical isolation, but hopefully we can all connect during this time over our shared mutual ravenous interest in sustainable food systems. So I will catch you guys later for our next adventure.